Welcome to this special episode of CP Newswatch. I'm Kathleen Harris, Ottawa Bureau Chief at the Canadian Press. The U.S. election is unfolding as some American communities reel from the devastating impact of two hurricanes. The United Nations says climate change is the largest crisis facing humanity today. Vice-President Kamala Harris and former President Donald Trump have starkly different plans for how, or even if, their administration would respond. Trump called climate change, quote, one of the great scams of all time. Harris, on the other hand, calls it an existential threat. Whoever becomes president will have a dramatic impact on the world's goal to cut the greenhouse gas emissions that cause climate change. That means Canada has a lot at stake as the battle between Democrats and Republicans remains in a dead heat. Canadian Press reporter Kelly Malone is our lead reporter on this file, and we've been speaking every week up until Election Day. This is part 3 of 4. Let's head to Washington. Hi, Kelly. Thanks for being here.
It's great to talk to you again.
So climate change is always a big topic here in Canada, but it hasn't necessarily received much of a focus from either party in speeches to voters during the U.S. campaign. We do hear the Vice President talk about how the Biden-Harris administration has passed legislation for the largest government investment in clean energy and climate initiatives, but she's also stepped back on promises to end fracking. So where does Harris actually stand on this issue?
I've actually been really surprised by how little climate change comes up, especially at this critical moment for the world. To provide a bit of background, a body of experts convened by the United Nations released a report last year saying the Earth is likely to cross a critical threshold for global warming within the next decade. That's the world hitting above 1.5 degrees Celsius sometime around the first half of the 2030s. If we go above that, the impact is catastrophic. We're talking heat waves, drought, and a lot of things that just make living on Earth hard. Under the Paris Climate Agreement, virtually every nation agreed to pursue efforts to hold global warming to that 1.5 degrees. Experts say Harris recognizes this urgency, and she has for a long time. They point to her past experiences. As California's Attorney General, she prosecuted oil companies for environmental violations. As a senator, she was an early co-sponsor of the Green New Deal, and she's previously suggested on a climate pollution fee. Experts say she's also expected to follow the climate path laid out under the Biden administration. One of the big environmental wins in the last 4 years was the Inflation Reduction Act, and she actually made the deciding vote in the Senate for it to pass. That legislation amounted to the largest infusion of government cash into climate and clean energy initiatives. We've heard her talk about that a lot on the campaign trail, how it increased access to lower cost clean energy while creating what she calls good jobs. So I talked to Lena Moffitt here in Washington. She's the executive director for Evergreen Action, a climate change advocacy group. She says Biden came in with a really strong environmental and climate platform.
And that included coming in on day one with things like a really robust climate and environmental justice executive action that set the stage for a whole lot of climate progress. And he embraced this all-of-government climate frame where he advanced both legislation, like we talked about, which was the most important thing he needed to do through the Inflation Reduction Act, but also tasked every single one of his agencies to become a climate agency. And that included things like standards on polluting sectors of the economy done via the EPA, to more money for climate-smart agriculture and farmers through the U.S. Department of Agriculture, to a Buy Clean initiative to send a signal to the U.S. economy that the government was going to be a source of demand for clean, low-carbon products. And it's been pretty impressive to see them continue that all-of-government frame over the ensuing 4 years. And it's that frame that we would very much hope and expect a Harris administration to continue.
Experts do have a couple of concerns. During the presidential debate, Harris boasted that the Biden-Harris administration had overseen the largest increase in domestic oil production in history. She also reversed that 2019 pledge to ban fracking. But experts I spoke with said only the Democrats have a plan for climate change.
Okay, so let's dive into the Republican plan or non-plan. Where does Donald Trump stand when it comes to this issue?
So just a taste of where we're going in this conversation. Trump called climate change a hoax, and just recently in the wake of Hurricane Helene said it was a scam. All the experts I spoke with say the first Trump administration caused a devastating blow to environmental regulations and climate policy. So a big one, Trump removed the US from the Paris Agreement. The Environmental Protection Agency shrank, and they actually removed the words climate change from its website. He put Scott Pruitt in charge of the EPA, and people describe that as putting a wolf in the hen's house. The agency lost hundreds of staff, including critical scientists. Pruitt was seriously so controversial. Just one example is a whistleblower came forward saying his aides were made to keep secret calendars and schedules to hide meetings or calls with oil industry representatives. Trump's first administration also saw sweeping attempts to roll back more than 100 environmental protections. So I spoke with Raul Garcia. He's with Earth Justice Action. They actually went to court to fight a lot of these changes under Trump.
Yeah, it was a punch to the gut. I can tell you that he undid long-standing protections that had been relied upon since the 70s, if not earlier, in order to keep our environment as healthy as possible. And so regulation after regulation, we saw him in a very ad hoc, convoluted, and oftentimes illegal way get rid of these requirements. And so that's what we challenged. And we said, you know, you are not a dictator. You cannot do this unilaterally. You need to do this through a process that takes into account community input, public input. And so, you know, we spoke up in that sense. And ultimately, many of our fights ended up in court, and we prevailed because he just took powers that did not belong to him.
The experts I spoke with say Trump's first time in office was probably just a starting point. They'd expect this time he'd go further. And he's made some direct comments. He did say he would go after the Inflation Reduction Act and end incentives for the electric vehicle market. But there's still a lot of unknowns. And the Republican Party platform doesn't really give any extra insight. It does say, quote, drill, baby, drill. And it also says the Republican Party would make America become, quote, energy independent and even dominant again. There's no mention of climate change at all. Now to Project 2025. This is the Heritage Foundation's blueprint for the next Republican president to usher in a sweeping overhaul of the government and really take a hard right turn for America. I will say Trump has distanced himself from Project 2025 and says he hasn't even read it. But since many of his current and former team have been associated with it, there's a lot of concern in the environmental community. Project 2025 calls for unleashing all of America's energy resources by eliminating federal restrictions on fossil fuel drilling on public lands and easing environmental permitting restrictions. It proposes closing the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and steering the National Weather Service to exclusively sell weather data to private forecasters. Experts I spoke with say Project 2025 amounts to a wholesale assault on any climate progress America has made so far.
So it seems that Trump and Harris really are on the opposite sides of the spectrum when it comes to the climate crisis and how to deal with it. So where do voters land on this?
It can be kind of surprising for a Canadian to hear, since we obviously care about the climate crisis a lot, but Americans just aren't really thinking about it as they're heading to the polls to vote. In almost every poll this whole campaign, the number one issue is the economy. And honestly, I think if you ask a Canadian right now, they're probably going to say economy, inflation, top priorities. But in a list of what American voters deem important, climate change is actually way at the bottom. Immigration, democracy in the US, terrorism and national security, even the types of Supreme Court justices, those are all way above in priorities than the climate crisis. In a recent Gallup poll, only 5% of Republicans thought climate change was extremely important. So I just kind of wanted to put this comparison out there. Polling last year in Canada found 72% of Canadians were worried or very worried about climate change. And jumping back a bit further, polling from Angus Reid in 2021, and that was around Canada's last federal election, it showed 1 in 5 Canadians saying climate change was the most important issue when it comes to supporting a party. That made it the top polling issue among topics that year. So anyway, back to the US, the experts I spoke with say the outcome in November will be critical for the world. Depending on who ends up in the White House, there could be serious questions about reaching global targets that keep all of us safe.
Oh, interesting. So we're in the final stretch now, American voters making up their minds. In Canada, there's a new poll from Leger that tells a pretty interesting story about how Canadians would cast a ballot in the US election if they could. Tell us about that.
So if Canadians could vote in the US election, they would support Kamala Harris. 64% said they'd vote for Harris, 21% said they'd vote for Donald Trump, and 15% were just unsure. Canadians aged 55 and older, Quebecers, and women were more likely to support Harris. And even among conservative voters, that's Canadians who intend to vote conservative in the next federal election, it was a pretty tight split. 42% said they'd vote for Harris, and 45% were more likely to vote for Trump. In general, 62% of Canadians believed that a Harris victory would be the best outcome for Canada, and they also thought that she would do a better job of dealing with the Canada-US relationship.
Very interesting. So what else are you going to be keeping an eye on in these final days of the campaign, Kelly?
I'm looking to see where Harris and Trump spend their final days and where they're spending their money. That will show us a little bit more about their final strategies and what battle states they think are the most at risk. Interestingly, Harris is actually heading to Washington Tuesday for a rally that's at the same location where Trump spoke ahead of the January 6th riot on Capitol Hill. Her team is billing it as a closing argument in true prosecutor fashion.
Kelly, thanks for joining us for this special episode. Looking forward to next week as the race comes to a near close. I'm Kathleen Harris, Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Canadian Press.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to follow and subscribe. For more of today's top stories, visit thecanadianpressnews.ca.